I'd also like to welcome our people that are live on our Join Me session here. For the in-house audience, if you guys would make sure your cell phones are on mute. Back to the webinar, folks. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in your panel to the right, and questions till afterwards. We'll have a Q&A after both presenters. Without further ado, Dr. Nancy Gassman with the City of Fort Lauderdale.
Good morning. A friendly groove. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about climate change, especially related to sea level rise and how the City of Fort Lauderdale is addressing these issues. And then Karen will follow up with a more regional view and with some tools that can help you learn how specific locations may be affected by sea level rise in the future. Okay. Working a minute ago. Nope, I guess I'll be giving the talk from here. Actually, Jonathan, I can't advance it. Perfect. So a lot of you may have seen these types of articles in papers and trade saying that we're doomed. This is not the message that we're bringing to you today. The message that we're bringing to you today is not goodbye to Southeast Florida, but hello. There are a lot of opportunities to improve the way that we address climate change and sea level rise. And it's going to take some very careful planning on the part of both developers as well as communities to develop in the right places. We all recognize that Fort Lauderdale or Pompano Beach of 100 years ago, it doesn't look the way it does today. And we have to recognize that our community 100 years from now is not going to look the way it does today. And so the message really is we have to evolve as a community, and we know that this is coming, and it gives us that opportunity to plan appropriately for it. If you look at the City of Fort Lauderdale, the areas in yellow and red, what I want you to really pay attention to is that the areas in red represent areas that are below 5 feet of elevation. Our city is a very, very low city. And because of that, we have some special challenges. We've got really 3 components of flooding that are related to climate change. The first one is that we're experiencing more extreme rainfalls. We used to see about 1/2 inch of rainfall in the afternoon every day in the summertime. And now what we're seeing is days and days where we don't have rain, and then days where we have incredible deluges that end up flooding the streets. We also have tidal flooding that's occurring primarily in the fall during what are called king tides. And these are tides that are predictable, and they occur, and they usually are somewhere between 6 and 12 inches above an average high tide for the year. And then we've got sea level rise, and I'll talk you through a little bit of each of these. Between the years of 1958 and 2012, we've seen a 27% increase in the amount of heavy downfalls, rainfalls. And this is occurring throughout the country, as this map is showing you. And those additional rainfalls are more than what our systems were designed to handle. And so now, instead of looking back and saying, what's the rainfall been like for the last 20 years, we have to look forward, predict what those rainfalls may be because of climate change, and start designing the new systems in a different way. We can no longer look backwards to predict the future. We have to look forward and anticipate the future. We're seeing a lot of tidal flooding, again, especially in the fall. Miami Beach has certainly been one of the areas that has been highlighted for the flooding that they've had along Alton Road. And for us, Los Olas Boulevard is an area that we're seeing regular flooding on. So I was talking to you a little bit about the king tide issue. This is what the tide cycle looks like over the course of an entire year. The red line there is showing you what the tide is like for the year. The purple line is showing you tides that are able to exceed 6 inches above that average high tide. And you'll notice that in the fall, we have these peaks. Those peaks are the king tides, those more extreme. In September, we had a pretty small king tide. It was, as predicted, about 6 or 8 inches above the average. But in October, November, we had much more extreme high tides, and we've got the next tide cycle coming here next week, starting on Monday. So September 2005 is a great example. The blue line here is what NOAA had predicted we would see in terms of tidal heights. The green line is what was actually observed. So the expectation was that a normal high tide is in the range, at this particular tide gauge, around half a foot. And we'll call that sea level for lack of a better term right now. The predicted high tide was going to be about a foot above it, but the observed high tide was actually 2 feet above the average high tide. This simulates a 2-foot sea level rise. So the flooding that we saw during this time would be the same flooding that we would see every single day when the sea rises by 2 feet. But it's a startling thing to come in and to go get your paper in the front door in the morning and discover that your front yard is underwater. The expectation going forward is that from a 1992 baseline of sea level rise, by the year 2030, we're expecting to see in the range of 6 to 10 inches of sea level rise. We've already seen 3 inches of that here in the year 2016. By the year 2060, 14 to 26 inches of additional sea level rise are likely. So the 2-foot range in the 50-year time frame is a target for us to look at. And some of this information is being used by municipalities to plan out their own infrastructure and determine what they're going to do. Again, we have to look forward, because that infrastructure is going to last for 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years, depending on what infrastructure is being put in. And we're planning for this. We recognize that the conditions that that infrastructure is going to experience, roadway, pump station, an electrical panel, we have to think about how long that piece of infrastructure is going to last and what are the conditions it'll experience during its lifetime. So we've talked about extreme rainfalls, we've talked about tidal flooding, and now we've talked about sea level rise. Because of that sea level rise, currently we have what are called 10 nuisance flooding events. Sometimes people call it sunny day flooding. We have about 10 of those events a year, keeping in mind 2 high tides every day. You might have an event in the morning, another event in the day. The expectation by the year 2045 in the South Florida area is that we're going to be seeing in the range of 240 of these events. So if those events occur on the same day, that's 120 days when we're going to see nuisance flooding. This is going to happen if we do nothing. But the municipalities, the local governments, the county governments, we're all working together to try to address these issues. And I want to explain to you a little bit about why we're seeing tidal flooding. This is an average house in an average area in the coastal area of Southeast Florida. You have a roadway, you have a storm drain, you have a driveway or a walkway that goes up toward the house because the house is perched. And so you've got your road, your yard is higher than the roadway. You've got this storm drain, there's a magical pipe under the ground that nobody pays attention to that then goes to some random water body. And what's happening is that under normal sea level, that pipe is exposed and water can freely run down it. But what happens when the sea level comes above that pipe? Well, you start getting this coastal flooding. Now keep in mind that the road is supposed to flood first. That road is part of the capacity that keeps your house from flooding. It just shouldn't happen every day. So what happens when we have this really high tide is that the water goes up the storm drain system, through the storm drain, and it floods the street. And that's salt water because that's a tidal water body. So anything that's in the coastal area that is on a tidal water body has the potential to have this type of flooding. What the City of Fort Lauderdale has been doing is that we've been putting in what are called backflow preventers or tidal valves. And what those do is they only allow the water to go out. In a situation where we have very, very high tide, those tidal valves prevent that roadway. But there's one caveat, and that is if it rains during the extreme high tide, the road will flood with fresh water, storm water, because there's no way for that valve to open if there's water inside that pipe coming from the coastal side. However, we're also seeing this situation where the high tide is so high, it's coming over the seawalls. It's running through the yards and then into the roadways. This is what we've been seeing in the very, very recent past. September last year, October of last year, and then October and November of this year as well, where the tides were so much higher than predicted that actually the water was not coming up the storm drains where we had backflow preventers, but it was coming through people's backyards and then into the roadway. One of the ways that we can deal with that is we can raise the seawall. This will work for a period of time until sea level rises so high that it ends up breaching it. But for these types of tidal impacts, this works great to raise the seawalls, but you have to raise the seawalls in an entire area in order to address that. One of the things the City of Lauderdale has done is they've concluded in their planning documents something called a designation for adaptation action areas. Any area that we have designated as an adaptation action area or a AAA are areas that the city is committing to invest in infrastructure in order to reduce flooding. When we first started talking about this concept, people were very concerned. I don't want to be in an adaptation action area. Well, if you have a flooding problem, you absolutely want to be in an adaptation action area because that means the city is going to invest in your community to reduce your risk of flooding. This is not in every community, but it is in the City of Fort Lauderdale. And we currently have 40 capital improvement projects that have been targeted for these locations in order to address flooding issues. So we talked about tidal valves, those backflow preventers, but the city is going to be investing in the range of between $50 million, $500 million, and $1 billion over the course of the next 10 years to look at a wide variety of tools in order to address the flooding issues from those 3 different causes that we talked about. We'll be using some very conventional stormwater management systems, but we'll also be looking at some opportunities to do more innovative technologies like bioswales, but recognizing that there are places that we can use pervious pavers, there's places that we can't. One of the great things in Florida is that we have a limestone base. Groundwater levels will also rise. That limestone. So unlike areas like the Netherlands, we can't just put a dike around our community and expect that's going to hold the water out because the water is just going to go up and under the dike and come up over time. So the city's been retrofitting all of these critical areas in the Los Olas Isles and Rio Vista area with tidal valves. We've installed 116 tidal valves, and we have 27 more that we'll be installing soon. What is the power of one of those tidal valves? This is a street called Del Mar in the city. And during the king tides in September of 28, where I showed you that we had a 2 foot above an average high tide, that whole street flooded. Now look at the date, September 28th. After the king tide subsided, we went in and we put a tidal valve on the street. This is high tide the very next day. These are very, very effective ways to address certain types of flooding. We went, can we turn these lights off?
I was just thinking that
Excellent. Does that mean we're going to have to reset the joining? We have to turn this on. Technical difficulties for those of you that are on the line. We're just getting our projector back on in the room. So we were going to try to turn a light off. Sure. We just went through a supermoon very recently. Those don't happen. Those happen on a decadal time scale. When we have those, we have a little boost, a couple extra inches. Generally speaking, the are in a 17-year period. But that's how NOAA determines their prediction of those tides. So every 17 years, they redo their model for the next 17 years. Now, what happened when we had that really, really extreme tide are external factors. One of the factors was that Hurricane Nicole was passing us, and the disturbance that it was causing in the ocean caused big swells to come on shore. We had easterly winds. When the winds are from the east, they push the water up against the coast, and then the tides can't escape, and so they build up. Last year, we had an issue where the Gulf Stream slowed down. And that might not sound very intuitive. Why, if the Gulf Stream slows down, would we have a higher tide? Well, if you're standing on a sidewalk and a big truck passes you, you feel that whoosh when it goes by. Well, think of that as Florida and the Gulf Stream. When the Gulf Stream is moving very quickly, it's pulling water away from the coast and entraining it into the Gulf Stream. But when it slows down, it's not as much of a whoosh, and so water sloshes back up. And last year, almost a foot of that additional tide that we experienced was because the Gulf Stream slowed down. No, it doesn't happen very often. And again, the researchers at NOAA were paying very close attention to it because it was so unusual. But again, it is attributable to climate change, because the way that the currents move have everything to do with the way that ice melts. And we're getting so much ice melt from Greenland at this point in time that it's actually affecting the way that the currents run, because the way that fresh water and salt water and the densities between the two interact. So we've gone from streets to Greenland. So let's get back to the streets. So what you see here is that the installation of that tidal valve, and these are the same houses that you see in both pictures. The installation of the tidal valve completely eliminated the flooding on this street. And so when you're talking to people about properties, knowing where tidal valves have been installed is actually a selling point, because again, the city has invested in those locations in order to reduce the vulnerability to flooding. We've also adopted a seawall ordinance, and the seawall ordinance is to help both public and private investments in seawalls moving forward. It sets a minimum and a maximum seawall elevation. It requires that people maintain their seawalls in good condition. In the past, you didn't have to worry about that. But think about any kind of code compliance. If you have a fence that's falling over, you can be cited by the city because you have a dilapidated fence. This is no different. And you now can be cited by the city if your seawall is crumbling and it's causing flooding to your neighbors. And it also requires that owners that have to prevent those tidal waters that enter their property from leaving. So if you have a property and the backyard floods during these high tides, you're not in violation. You're in violation if that water goes past your backyard, moves into your front yard, and then floods the street. And you can be cited for that. So when would a seawall have to be raised? It would have to be raised if you're installing a brand new seawall. You have to come up to the new minimum. If you are permitting the seawall for a repair and it's determined that more than 50% of your seawall is damaged, you have to bring it up to the new elevation. If you're permitting for a repair because you've been cited and the substantial threshold is triggered, you have to build up to the new elevation. And the last one is if the owner is cited for tidal flooding that leaves their property and they're going to install a new seawall, they've got to raise it to the new minimum. Yes? Previously in the city of Fort Lauderdale, we only had a maximum that was set. And when these king tides came in, the city commission directed staff to develop a seawall ordinance that set both a minimum and a maximum. So the minimum is new. We didn't previously have a minimum. And what I'm seeing throughout the coastal area is that now that we've passed ours and Miami Beach has also passed a seawall ordinance, that the coastal communities are getting more and more interested in setting minimums for their seawalls moving forward. The last time we redid the city ordinance was in 2010, and again, that was to set a maximum, not to set a minimum. So it doesn't happen that often, but we are in a new situation. This is an emerging situation. From now until the next time the ordinance gets changed, there's a minimum that is set for all new construction. And if the conditions change dramatically relative to sea level rise, we may be seeing another change coming in the future. One of the things I'll make a note is that when we originally proposed the seawall ordinance, what we mandated that every seawall in the city be raised to a certain height by a certain date. And there was a lot of pushback. Property owners didn't like that. And so we changed it to say those individual properties that are causing the problem, that are causing nuisance flooding, they are the ones responsible for raising their seawalls. Otherwise, only if you build a new one do you have to raise yours. Yeah.
A little bit further. So if you buy a greenfield, an empty lot,
Mm-hmm.
you go in, so you first thing you would want to do, or I think required to do, is build that seawall up. If you build that seawall up,
You're not required to build the seawall up.
you are not.
Unless you go in and say, I want to build a new seawall, then you have to build it to the new minimum.
To the new minimum, which means all of a sudden now you've got to backfill a lot of dirt, grade, which is a lot more expensive, I would assume.
Right, but the other thing that happens is that you're going to come into, if there's a greenfield in a waterway area, that's an unusual property to begin with. But if you have that, or if you have a knockdown, what's going to happen is that you're going to be required to bring that lot up to the new base flood elevation. So you're going to be backfilling that lot anyway, and that's going to benefit the new house, and it's probably going to be consistent with putting in a new seawall. So again, there's been a lot of press. Close to 1 million Florida homes are going to be underwater from sea level rise. This was a Zillow article, and it was showing that if the oceans rise 6 feet, we're going to be looking at, again, close to 1 million homes in Florida. But that 6 feet's really important, because I know that you guys think in mortgage cycles. The city thinks in elected official cycles and infrastructure cycles. So 4 to 8 year terms, and we think in 50-year time frames. 6 feet, as we discussed, is at the end of the century, is the likelihood. So that's at least 3 mortgage cycles. And that's if the worst case scenario happens. So do we have situations that we need to plan for in the future? Absolutely. Is it today that we should abandon a home or a property? No, you have to look at what the vulnerabilities are of that property before you make those kinds of decisions. This is the city of Fort Lauderdale. The areas in orange and purple are areas that are potentially below sea level if we got a 2-foot sea level rise. This represents the no action option. If the city does nothing and if private homeowners do nothing, this is going to be the result. But private homeowners, as Jeremy pointed out, are raising their properties. As they're buying green fields or knockdowns, they're raising their properties. What might have been a dot on this map today when this particular elevation was cited may not be the condition it is now, because somebody came in, they raised the elevation, they raised the road. So this is the no action option, but people are taking action. Here's an area in Las Olas. Las Olas Boulevard floods regularly when we have this tidal flooding. The city has put in a berm all along that seawall to prevent the water from leaving. It can still come over the seawall, but it can no longer get into the roadway. We're working with the Department of Transportation, because Las Olas Boulevard is their roadway, to put in those tidal valves in all of their storm drains. So we're working across jurisdictions to try to accomplish this from the government side, but there's also investments like new seawalls that the private side also needs to invest in order to protect them from flooding and to increase the resiliency of our community. Karen's going to share with you a number of tools, and I want to show you just one that's available from FIU. This is where we are today. This is your property, and this is what it looks like under a 0 sea level rise, under current sea level rise conditions. And it tells us that the elevation of this property is roughly 10 feet. If we look at 2 feet, which is, if you remember, the 2060 estimate of the worst case scenario, you can see that this property continues to remain high and dry. And I'm going to go backwards real quick. Look in these areas along the intercoastal. So you can see that along the intercoastal, at 2 feet of sea level rise, there are areas that could potentially be inundated. And those are areas that municipalities should focus on in order to put infrastructure improvements in those locations to reduce the flooding. And here's 3 feet of sea level rise. So this is toward the end of the century. And you can see that now you're starting to see a little bit more inundation coming a little bit closer to home. But I think the other thing I want to point out to you is that notice that those are the roadways. And we talked about the fact that the properties are perched above the roadways, and the roadways are a little bit lower in order to protect those properties. Again, there's opportunities for municipalities to look at these types of maps, target those locations, and look for infrastructure improvements in those locations. But there's going to be some locations that we're not going to be able to develop the infrastructure or provide enough fill in order to save. Every community evolves with time, and we have to recognize that our community is evolving as well. 10 years ago, it didn't look the same. 10 years from now, it's not going to look the same. It's part of the normal evolution of a community. So, in my opinion, tidal valves, tidal flooding is an important fact to disclose when you're talking to individuals and you're trying to sell them a property where you know the street's regularly flooding. It affects their access to their property. But I think it's every bit as important to tell them what the local municipalities are doing in order to reduce vulnerabilities in that location and to create a more resilient community. Because this looked like this. This was taken in 2013. This property was raised, and we've put tidal valves all along. This type of flooding is not happening in this location anymore. And so people have to be educated about what the municipalities are doing. So some of the things you might want to think about for residential real estate is to start thinking about how you sell resiliency. Because you're salespeople. You're in the business of marketing. How do you tell someone or convince a potential buyer that this property is a resilient property? Know what the finished elevation. Air conditioners or other critical equipment are at the elevated, because that's going to make it a more resilient home to not just from things like sea level rise, but from storm surge. How quickly can that both adaptation action areas? You can also, we have a customer service line. You can call them and ask them to connect you with engineering or one of the other groups to find out if there's a tidal valve on a specific street or if there's a pump on a specific street. I haven't had a lot of interaction with Pompano Beach specifically. We're on Atlantic Boulevard. One side of Atlantic Boulevard is at one elevation, and the other side of Atlantic Boulevard is 4 feet higher. Pompano, relative to elevation, is pretty high, but there are locations within Pompano that are low-lying. And one of the things you can do is go to that Eye on the Rise website that I showed you, and you can pick a property and look at where it would be in 50 years. Other questions? Okay, we're for those of you that are online, we're waiting for Karen and Jeremy to come back in the room. There we go. Karen, you ready? One of the things I will mention is that for barrier islands, the properties that are on the intercoastal side tend to be much lower elevation than the properties on the side, because the properties on the ocean side were built on the old dune system. And so when you're seeing flooding on the barrier islands, it tends to be on the intercoastal side. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Gaston. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen. So I'm a scientist. Dr. Gassman is a scientist, and we look at data. But we're here because we're trying to kind of translate it to something that's useful to you, right? So I'm curious. I would like for this to be more of a conversational. So interrupt me with questions, and I want to ask you questions. So I'm curious. I want to start off by asking, how many of you guys have clients that you take them to homes and they're, it's right on the water, and they wonder, like, is this in a flood zone? What are the tidal risks? Do you get questions about that? And do you feel like you have enough information to give them? Okay, because I think that's the crux of it, is how to take this. There's what I've been seeing in my research, and I'll talk a lot more about this, is this information action gap, right? You saw the NOAA tide gauge records. They're so extensive. There's so much information out there, but it's in the academia or it's in the science world, and it's not actually translating to where it makes a difference. And that's where my intention comes in. I'm committed towards, and I'm talking to you guys today because I want to increase awareness about sea level rise impacts. And how do you increase awareness? Through effective communication. And so you have to take all of this, we say these words in our spheres like sustainability and resilience, and we have to kind of translate it to things that are actionable and that can make a difference. So, with this effective communication, that's what translates to changes in behavior and towards, real changes that people are safe and prepared. And that's my commitment. And that's, a lot of what I see out there, especially in the media, like these Goodbye Miami and the headlines that Dr. Gassman showed you, they're very alarmist. And it's not productive to be so alarmist, because as you saw from the maps, it's not, Florida's going underwater and we should all move. That's not the message. And that's not the message that our local governments are sending. There's one thing on the news that say, this is a huge, the projections, we stopped them at 2100, but it's not like sea level stops rising at that point. It's going to keep going same accelerated in the next 200 years. It could be up to 10 feet, 20 feet, but technology, I think there's a lot of hope, right? So that's my summary, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'll tell you. I don't know if the water evaporates into this universe. Oh, of course. I will repeat the question. Yes. What is the max when all the ice caps melt? Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so when all of the ice melts, and I did a TED Talk where I have a really fun, I did it in Miami at the Art Center, and I have this picture of the Bank of America building, and it's 212 feet. That's how high. And sea levels have been that much higher. So like in over geologic history, sea level has ranged. That's another theme in my talk is misconceptions. We through the time that humans have been on Earth, we've seen these kind of standard sea level. It's been very stable, and that's how our barrier islands have formed. Because we needed that stability so all of the coral reefs could build up the limestone. But if you go back to the, the ice ages and the interglacials, because think about it, when the last ice age, what was happening? All the water that was evaporating from the oceans, it's falling and it's just freezing as land ice. So were the oceans higher or lower during an ice age? They're lower, right? And then you have these interglacials. So between the ice ages, it's super hot, all the land ice melts, and that's when those sea levels are 200 plus feet higher. So what does Florida look like? And that's what I show. I don't have the maps here, but I mean, if you look at Florida during these interglacials where sea levels are lower, if you went to Tampa, Naples, you'd have to go another 200 miles west to get to the beach. That's how Florida is huge. But then if you go during the interglacials, when sea levels were so much higher, Florida was this tiny little sliver of nothing. So it's, Florida has looked very different, the shape of Florida, over history. So things are really changing. I mean, we talk natural on the barrier islands. I'm getting ahead of myself, but I want to, answer your questions. So please feel free to keep interrupting me. But I'll go back to my when they get hot, they get bigger, right? That's what thermal expansion is. It's a simple law of physics that temperature goes up, volume goes up. So as these temperatures are heating up in the oceans, they're growing. Not only are they growing, they're getting more acidic. And that's a big issue, especially for our tourism. I was just at one of our council meetings. You guys know Commissioner Beamfer. He's on the Oceans Council, and he was talking about some research they're doing on the coral reefs, and the diseases and the bleaching has been unprecedented. And that's a problem because of all this carbon in the oceans. It creates carbonic acid, right? So acid, it lowers the pH, and it's really bad for the coral reefs. So these are just other impacts. Anyways, getting back to what causes sea level rise. So there's distinctions between global and local sea level rise. Global sea level is rising because of two things, right? The ice melting, land ice, and the thermal expansion. Now, that's happening around the world. And then there's local factors. So in this graph, you can see different cities all over the US, and they all have different rates, amounts of sea level rise that have been measured in the past 50 years. Over here on the right, we have Galveston, Texas. You guys been there? It's so pretty. I was just there last month. And then on the other side, we have LA. And so Florida is, here's Key West. We kind of match that's 5.5 inches. We kind of match the global rate. So we don't have any local factors that are, that's a whole nother talk, factors. So I won't be down with those, but they have to do with local, like for example, in New Orleans where they're pumping out all the water and it's subsidence, right? Or there's things called isostatic glacial rebound. Okay, so now I sound smart. So that's why the sea level is rising. What are the impacts? And this is another, so we talk about these misconceptions, like Florida's going underwater, but it's not going to happen until much later in the future. Okay, that's a huge misconception because it's not just land going underwater. There's water management impacts, and it goes beyond, there's things that are already happening now. So we have this unique geology in Florida that we're completely surrounded by water, right? We have the ocean to the east, we have the Everglades to the west, water comes from the sky, and it also comes from underground. We have a very shallow water table, and I'll talk about that more. So and then we have the seasons, right? So we have our wet season, which we're in now, and it's raining a lot more, and then we have the dry season. So in the wet season, we're concerned about the flooding, right? It's called groundwater flooding, and I'll talk more about it, but it's basically where we have too much water and we have compromised drainage, versus in the dry season, we're just concerned about, keeping our water and preventing saltwater intrusion. So we'll talk more about that, but it's really an issue because just in Broward County, we have 1,800 miles of canals. Is that it? That's a lot. So the Water Management District has, anything west of 95 used to be the Everglades, right? And even when I grew up in Coral Springs, half of it wasn't there. It was just still, so they're really developing and draining the land, and that's why we dug all these canals. So there's a lot of water management issues. There's also the beach erosion, and we're worried about that. We're worried about our beaches. We're worried about our habitat loss. For example, the sea turtle nesting in the beaches. I have a few more slides illustrating this concept of groundwater storage because it's really important to actually visualize. But I just want to mention this topography that we have, because in most areas in the world, as you move from the ocean inland, the land just keeps going up, right? It's very different here. What's different here is what you notice, the dunes are actually very, very high. So a lot of areas right on the ocean are not even in a flood zone. You go out east here and the dunes are maybe 10 to 15 feet all along the coast. They're very, very high. It's only as you move towards the intercoastal, and Dr. Gassman mentioned this, it's like, the way things were developed, they were mangroves, and it's really along the intercoastal, you have really low-lying land. And that's, just a trend that I've seen all along our coast. And then you go a little bit further in, and there's a coastal ridge, and then as you go towards the Everglades, the land dips down. So we have this unique topography. And then also, have you noticed what's higher, the buildings or the streets? The streets are lower. So most of the flooding we're getting is in the streets. So let's talk more about this geology. So this is what is underneath us, right? Where do we get our water from? It's stored in these little holes in the limestone. And again, this is from coral reefs, ancient coral reefs that Florida is built upon. So we get all of our water from the Biscayne aquifer. And the reason that we're concerned about saltwater intrusion, there's two reasons. Okay, so this is the first one, is that in Hollandale Beach, they've already had to move 6 of their 8 wells west. And the reason is because we have this wedge of the saltwater underground moving in. And as it moves in, it contaminates our water supply. So that's a huge issue because we have growing population, development, growing demands. We really need to conserve our water supply. This one's easier to understand than the other issues. So I created this animation to really look at this wedge and think about the difference between freshwater and saltwater. Which one is denser? Saltwater, right? It's much denser. So freshwater is floating above the saltwater, and then you have this kind of membrane where it's pushing inland. It's not only pushing inland, it's pushing up, and it actually lifts our fresh water closer and closer to the surface. And a lot of places here in South Florida during the wet season, this is why we don't have basements, right? Sometimes it's just to do some work on the pipes in the wet season, they have to drain the land. You don't have, a foot or two below ground and you get to the water table. I mean, you ever drive along the sawgrass and notice, those little ditches along the side? It hasn't rained for a week and yet there's water. That's our water table. So it's a huge issue, and it's not something that's permanent year round. It's just going to be happening a few days per year more, depending on all of these other issues, right? Depending on, in some areas further east, the water table is tidally influenced. And then we have the flow from the Everglades, and we have all this water moving between the canals. So it is very complicated. This is a simplistic view of it, but just to help you conceptualize that it's something that's slowly getting worse, but it's just going to be, you have to start thinking about how many days per year are you okay with having water in your streets or in your yard? And, so again, these are the projections going out to 2100, up to 6 feet. There's the chances are it's going to be below 6 feet. That's the maximum. It's a little over 6 feet. So what does that look like? It's not just our region. I made this map, I zoomed into Miami Beach. But if you look at areas all over Florida, clearly we're a hot spot. This is from the same Zillow. Why did Zillow do this? I still don't understand. That clearly, if you rank all of the different states that are vulnerable to this 6 feet number, which again, it was a very kind of dramatic number, but Florida just is off the charts with almost $1 billion in property value that are vulnerable. Again, these are very similar to Dr. Gassman's charts. We're all looking at these, the Virginia Key Tide Gauge, which is on the UM Rasmus campus, and comparing what happened September, October, November, and seeing that, September was much lower because of, it was matched what was predicted at, because we had this high pressure that was keeping the sea levels lower and the winds. But then in October and November, we had, this 2-foot rise. So what does that look like? So I'm going to tell you, this is where I'm going to get into my 2 projects. You have another question?
Well, I went back to the water table.
Yeah.
Is there a point of no return for saltwater intrusion in the water table, and what is that time frame? Or is there a projection like sea level rise for the water table?
I'll tell you that groundwater is one of the biggest uncertainties. And originally for my dissertation, I wanted to model just the groundwater, and it's just such a, this other stuff we feel certain talking about, the groundwater, because the thing about climate change, we're talking about sea level rise, but climate change has to do with these increased temperatures and with changes in precipitation, the extreme weather. So the dry periods get drier, the wet periods get wetter. And there's something called downscaling, where you look at global climate models and you figure out what they're going to do for your region. Well, for our region, in terms of precipitation, we have no idea whether it's going to be somewhere between a 10% decrease or a 10% increase. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, when you're talking about groundwater, is there a point of no return? There's a point at which the groundwater will become the surface water. So if you think about it that way, it will no longer be hidden under the soil. It will now be emergent. So is there a point of no return for certain locations? Yes, there is. And the opportunities are either you can fill those locations and raise the land, or you can use those locations for alternative land uses and move inappropriate land uses to another location. And again, that happens all the time as a community. Areas that were once residential become multifamily. Areas that used to be multifamily become commercial. And there are times when we take over an area and we make it into a park or we change it. So there are locations that are not going to look the way they do today. And that's in part maybe because the groundwater levels have come up so high. But so the freshwater potable water question, the county, Broward County, has recently done an integrated model that looked at both surface and groundwater, and they looked at all of the well fields along the coast in Broward County to determine when the groundwater levels would then create a situation where we'd have to use either alternative methods to treat the water so that we could have potable water, or where well fields would probably need to be abandoned. City of Fort Lauderdale, our well fields are far enough west. We are in good shape for at least the next 50 years. And again, treatment technologies are changing where you don't have to take fresh water and treat it. You can use salt water and you can treat that salt water and make it fresh water. So there's both technology opportunities and spatial opportunities where, for example, the city of Hallandale no longer uses most of its wells. It goes to the municipality that's slightly more inland and gets their water from them. So there's ways to get around those issues. And at this point in time, there is no crisis in our potable water for our area.
Yeah, there's a lot of studies being done now that look at water demand, and I think, it's a complicated question, point of no return, but because I think that it really depends on what happens with the precipitation. We know about this groundwater rise, but there's just so many other factors because of the Everglades. And anyways, let's move on. So what does this look like? What are these? So my first project that I want to tell you about is about infrastructure resilience. And what we're doing is we're ground truthing. So it's one thing to map where it's going to flood. It's another thing to actually go there and see what it looks like. Clearly with Dr. Gassman's pictures, you saw that there are pumps, there's there's the valves, the backflow preventers that change how it looks. So a project that we're doing with the 3 counties, we chose 2 communities in each county. So for Broward, we're doing Dania Beach and Hollywood. So we actually went out during the high tide and looked at how high, measured with a ruler how high the water was and what it looked like compared to what it looks like on the maps. So I'm going to show you some of the results there. So this is the same, this is the Hollywood, the South Lake. This is what it looked like in September when it was only at that 1 foot above normal. And then here's October with the 2 feet. So you can see that extra foot makes a huge difference. It's the same place. See that little left arrow? What's really cool is that there's a little, there's like a grassroots organization that came out of the temple in Hollywood, and they had, kids out there, and it was just a huge event to kind of look at what's going on. So it was really nice to see all the community getting engaged and looking at the high water. So I wanted to, this is a positive note. Like I mentioned, I was in Galveston last month, and their storm surge is so high. When I modeled the storm surge for this area, and just because of certain factors, like our storm surge can't get higher than 10 feet. And that's a maximum of maximum. So we really don't get a lot of storm surge here compared to areas along the Gulf. The maximum surge in, this area around Galveston, the coast of Texas, is closer to 40 feet. And it has to do with the fact that there's a bigger shelf and all these other things. But so, I was out in the Bolivar Peninsula, and every house looks like this. I mean, they're just all so high up. There was a school this high up. So this is my good, just in case you guys are getting a little depressed, this is a brighter note, right? It's not, the storm surge is not terrible, but sea level rise does, you talk about things like 6 inches and it doesn't do much, but then when you add storm surge to that 6 inch of sea level rise, that's going to really make the difference of how much further inland that storm surge will go. So it's an important point to talk about storms. which we haven't had a big surge, right? Most of our hurricanes have just been winds. So I want to talk just a little bit about this word inundation and what it means. It's really, you know, with the maps and the tools I'm going to show you, it's comparing water levels, various water levels, because there's a mean sea level, there's the high tide every day, there's the high tide of the year. So comparing that to land elevation, so we can kind of see when the land, you know, at those points where the land is below the water, that's what we call inundation. But there's different kinds of inundation. There's the storm surge, there's areas, so there's this distinction of like, what are the impacts along the coast versus what are the inland impacts? And that's a big, in my research, that was a big misconception that I found. People that lived in my area out west in Coral Springs thought, oh, we're so far inland, we're safe. What they don't realize is there's this groundwater issue and also the drainage, because if there's a big storm, every city east of you is trying to drain into the ocean. It's like a traffic jam. You're the last one that gets drained. So there's different, so those are the issues inland versus clearly on the coast, there's more issues like the erosion, tidal flooding, and storm surge. So there's different types of inundation. And this, by the way, this picture is also in Hollywood around South Lake. I just thought the car was funny. So this is where I was measuring in North Miami. So I basically, all these little points, and I put this in a Google map if any of you guys want it, but I went to these different points along North Miami. See, that's like the FIU campus up there. Do you guys recognize this area? And this is like 135th. I modeled that all these places would flood, and what was interesting, so on the map it looks like it's going to flood, but then when you actually go there, is a different story. So here's an area that looked like, that was modeled as a hotspot for flooding. Looks fine, right? And this is another thing, like on Dr. Gassman's map of Broward County, there was a big blotch of purple. Well, that's a wetland, right? And it's already kind of at sea level. And those mangroves can actually accrete, you know, they can actually build up with sea level rise. So, and they can migrate as long as they have room to migrate. So with the natural areas, they stick out as hotspots, but in reality, there's not too much exposure in terms of, you know, property loss or damage to those like infrastructure, built environment assets. Whereas, you know, you look at the pictures on the bottom, like I had to sneak into this community and, you know, the areas, so this community, they didn't have, their streets were not flooded because they had backflow preventers, but it looked like their boats were going to float into their yard. And, you know, they had their docks flooded. This picture, the pictures on the top were the saddest ones because there was almost 2 feet of water in this trailer park, and it was just water going the wrong way up the drains, and it smelled terrible. They're all on septic tanks, and it was disgusting. Like this, I took some samples. I mean, you could smell sulfuric acid. So my point here is that, you know, not all inundation is the same, and it's one thing to look at a map. It's another thing to actually go there and see, you know, the same water levels have different impacts, depending on what type of community you're in, what type of improvements they've made, and, you know, how many natural areas there are. So I'm going to get into, I know I'm running out of time, but this part, I'm going to breeze through it because it's exciting to see something happening on a state level. And so this project, my former boss at the Planning Council, his name is Jim Murley, and he's now the resilience officer for Miami-Dade County. He had this big idea that, you know, there's 10 planning councils in Florida, and they came about because of all this growth management that was happening, and how can we work together as a state? And so I'm managing the project, and I've been working with the 9 other planning councils to do trainings with the local governments on using these tools. So I'm going to quickly go through the tools, but the idea of this project, it's exciting to see something happening on a state level. Like most of what's happening here is just our region or the local governments. But to see all of the state, you know, coming together and learning how to use these tools. And I think that you know, the next steps are to do other projects as a state. And I like that. I like working with the other parts of Florida and seeing what their issues are, because we all have our own unique issues, but we have similarities too. And the big idea is, you know, this translation of science to policy so we can be prepared. So this is the whole team from all the planning councils. We got together back in March and we did a training. We met with people from NOAA, people from UF that created all the tools, and we learned about them so that we could do our own training. So this is a picture of the training that I did. That's me. I was telling everyone to vote on their favorite tool. So it was really great. We did this training in Lake Worth, and it was amazing that, you know, everyone was so excited to learn about the tools. And, you know, a lot of these local governments, they're hiring consultants. And I get so frustrated because I see how much they paid the consultants, and I'm like, you could have just used this tool, you know, and you guys can use them too. So I'll go through them really quickly. I mean, NOAA has 58 tools on their website. It's called the Digital Coast, and there's a county snapshot tool. There's tools that have to do with economics and tourism. Really interesting. So I'm only going to focus on 3 of the NOAA tools and 1 other tool. I'm going to go through really fast because I know we're running out of time, but I do? Awesome. Okay. I'll slow down a little bit. So these are the 4 tools. I'm going to go through a little more slowly. And so there's, these 3 tools are from NOAA. And I can give you the website. So anybody can go to the website and use these tools. So the NOAA tools are for the entire country and along the coast. And the UF tool is for Florida, and it's focused on transportation. And if you guys are trying to understand, you know, what's going on in one of the neighborhoods, you know, you can't get down to the property level like you can with the FIU tool. You can actually go to zoom to more parcel level, and that's great. But it only shows you the elevation and the water levels. These tools give you a lot more information. So you know, you want to be able, you want to figure out which tool. Like maybe you can come up with your own method of what you want to use, but at least now you have some background on them. And if you got, I'll give you all my cards. If I have handouts on all these tools, like really simplistic handouts on how to use them. So I'm going to give you a really quick overview, but if you want more information, I have tons. So we'll start with Canvas. Canvas is basically Photoshop. Okay, so this one, you actually have to download the tool. You go somewhere along the coast, you take a picture, and then you can input it to the kind of Photoshop canvas and raise the water level. And not only raise the water level, you can add things, like you can raise a seawall, you can add all kinds of infrastructure. So you can really, this is a good visual tool. Like sometimes people look at maps and they're like, yeah, I don't really, it doesn't really engage them as much as actually seeing some kind of landmark. Do you guys recognize this park? It's in Sarasota. So this is with just 3 feet of sea level rise. This park is in trouble. All the dolphins are back in the water. So that's basically the overview of this tool. I won't get into more details, but the other 3 tools, you know, I want to talk about the data because it's really important that these maps actually come from very credible, legitimate sources. And so these are the, you know, 3 main ingredients to do any kind of, you know, sea level rise maps, right? So the first one is the local trends. So that's where we have the tide gauges measuring, you know, 6-minute water levels and inputting these local trends. Then we have projecting those trends into the future. So we have very curves. There's one curve from NOAA. There's another curve from the Army Corps of Engineers. If you want to know more about those, I have handouts, but I won't get too much into it. But we'll just say that NOAA's higher and that our climate compact follows the Army Corps of Engineer curve. So we use the curves. And then the last ingredient is the elevation. And so have you guys ever heard of LiDAR? Yeah, so LiDAR is the best quality elevation data that's out there. It's, you know, plane flies over and sends down lasers, and it's really high quality, and we have it for the whole state of Florida along the coast. So we use this data, we put them into our tools, and they're the best available, right? Yes, it is older, but Miami-Dade has brand new from last year. Yeah. Yeah, so it is a little older, so that's one issue.
So LiDAR just being laser versus radar, which is radio waves, correct?
Yeah, LiDAR is really just, yeah, laser, something, yeah, I have it somewhere. Yeah.
But it's basically a very techy way.
So you have all of this data, and it's showing you the likelihood of impact, right? What is the likelihood that some area will be inundated? Now, it's one thing to know the likelihood, that's your risk, but to get to actually vulnerability, you have to know what's the exposure, right? Because like those wetlands, the water goes in, the water goes out, is very high risk, but there's no consequence, right? Versus areas that are low-lying that have really high-valued property and there's property damage, like that's a big exposure. So the idea with these tools is that you take this likelihood layer of where the water will go, and then you overlay it with different assets, population data from the census, things like that. So I'm going to show you the roads. There's the transportation tool. So I'm going to show you how the tools can overlay so you can find areas not only that are low-lying, but that have the risk that you're interested in looking at. And this is what the local governments are really trying to do, because we have limited resources, so we need to prioritize, like which are the areas that, you know, we really need to focus on, whether you're trying to protect infrastructure or certain types of property or certain populations. So we're going to get, so that's why with the sea level rise viewer, this tool, so, and really if you just Google NOAA sea level rise tool, you'll find all these tools. You just Google it and you find it, okay? So you go to the website, you say launch, you click this green button, launch. And what's nice about this tool is that not only do you have the inundation, but you have the confidence. So how sure are we? You know, the blue areas we're very sure. So there's like different layers that you can turn on and off. Like when you go to the tool, I'll show you on the next slide, but I just want to mention these layers, that there's a flood frequency, there's a social vulnerability, and then there's the marsh impacts, which has to do with what I talked about, that the mangroves can actually keep up with sea level rise to a certain extent. So when you go into the tool, so you hit launch, and then you'll see something like this. So here's Fort Lauderdale. And you can see, like, so right here, this is like a little slider bar. So you can go up to 6 feet. You can raise the sea level up to 6 feet with the slider bar. And then all those layers I showed you on the last slide, you can turn them on just by clicking them, right? So what's the difference here between the green and the blue? The blue is seawater. Yeah, that's really good. Yes, pretty much. It's a good way to put it. Right. So there's this term we have called hydrologic connectivity. And the idea is that if water is, you know, if we have an area that's going to be inundated and it's connected to the ocean through the surface, then it's blue. And the darker blue it is, the deeper it's going to be. And again, we have, again, this area here, a lot of it is wetlands, right? Where it's going to be the most inundation. And then these areas west, they're not connected. You know, there's parts of Davie that are, you know, below 3 feet, but they're not connected to the ocean. But because of that limestone and the groundwater rise, we can't ignore them, but we should definitely distinguish between them because of those differences between inland and coastal. Something else I want to point out is a canvas tool is actually built in here. So if you go to the tool and you find these little camera icons and you click them, like here will take you to Taylor Birch State Park, and you can actually raise, as you raise the sea level bar, the water goes up in Birch State Park. So even if you don't want to download the canvas tool, it's in the sea level rise viewer. So this is a great tool. But when I asked my participants in the training to vote, they didn't vote on this one. They voted on this one. This is the newest tool, the flood exposure mapper. And maybe it's because I was running that. We did breakouts, and that was mine. I don't know. I love this tool. It's amazing. I like it because you can overlay flood hazards. There's so many. This one has storm surge. It has the flood zones, and you can overlay it with the other layers, like I mentioned, the exposure. So there's the, you know, the flood hazards. There's a composite one that puts them all together. There's the FEMA flood zones, the storm surge zones, sea level rise scenarios, and then you can overlay that with all these different population statistics from the census, different infrastructure. There's the hospitals and schools and police stations, and then the ecosystems that has different types of, you know, beaches, mangroves, areas like that. So that's really cool that you can look at all of those things together. So this is basically what the composite looks like for Tampa. You can get up to 10 hazard zones, but what's really cool if you go into this tool, people might not realize, is that it's actually click on anywhere that has a color from yellow to red, because clearly red has more risk zones, right? If you click on one, then this box pops up that looks like the box on the left, and it actually tells you what zones they're in. So you can really get a lot of information where it kind of aggregates the different risks. So that's a really nice tool. The last tool I want to talk about is the most complicated one. It was created, US has a geoplan center, and they have a lot of data that comes out of there. And this was funded by the Department of Transportation. So when you go to the tool, you get a map of Florida, and it's organized by districts. So in Broward County, we're in District 4. So if you click District 4, they have a map viewer that shows you all the counties in District 4, and you could basically raise the sea level and look at, but what's nice is there's like a little table below here. I deleted that slide I was trying to cut. This little so it has all of the different roads, whether they're county roads, highways, state roads, and then when you raise the sea level, and they have it by decades, like 2020, 2030, there's this little table that pops up below, and it actually quantifies the road segments. So it's like, okay, at high tide in 2040, in whatever you have in view, there's going to be 1 mile of road segment that's underwater at high tide. So it's, you know, it's an interesting tool. The transportation planners love it. It's good for them because they're really trying to prioritize. Raising the roads is very expensive, and it's going to be a big issue because the roads are the lowest areas other than the wetlands, right? So this is a tool for the sketch plan. I went through them really quickly. Do you guys have any questions about the tools? Because my wrap up is more about solutions. No questions on the tools? Okay, I will give you guys all my cards, and I have like more information on how to use them if you're interested, because I know that was really fast. But yeah, so what is this call to action? What's being done? At the Planning Council, the biggest thing is the land use, right? Because all of the counties in the cities, they have a comprehensive land use plan, which has a coastal management element. And Fort Lauderdale, cities in Miami, they're adding these adaptation action areas. And there's a new legislation that's called peril of flood. It has to do with redevelopment that has to consider sea level rise. So all of a sudden, the cities and counties are being required to kind of change around their land use strategies. You know, before the strategy was, well, prevent sprawl, right? So how do you prevent sprawl is you keep building in these dense areas. But what if the dense areas are really low lying? Then you're just increasing the risk. So it's a trade-off. And I'm not saying we should just all move to Coral Springs. It's a trade-off that you need to think about. So, land use regulations is important. Insurance is huge, right? I mean, whether you're in a flood zone, even, property, the homeowner's insurance is going crazy. It was so much for me this year. It was very painful. So, and the problem is, there's all this, what if they change, right? Right now, the flood insurance, the flood zones are changing, the rates are changing, and they're subsidized. So coastal areas are paying lower. And what happens if all of a sudden they change to actuarial rates and, you can't afford your flood insurance? You bought this house thinking it was affordable and all of a sudden it's not. So that's a big concern. The updates for drainage are huge. They can do so much, as Dr. Gassman talked about. Another one is co-benefits. A lot of these things have a huge price tag, but what's important to know is that whether or not sea level rises, most of these things are going to save us money just because of the storm surge and the aging infrastructure needs to be updated. So yes, there's a price tag, but the damage that's done if we don't take these actions is even more. Other co-benefits have to do with health and things like that. So I have this list of different things you can do to protect, whether it's natural or kind of gray infrastructure or hardened seawalls, pumps, and then there's also, so here's a backflow preventer. And this is in North Bay Village. This was a sewage. I was there last month during the king tide. That's the public works director. Isn't North Bay Village the best? I love it there. And the water was just coming, but the problem was their pumps work on a generator and it stopped working. It got wet during the king tide, and so the sewage was just coming out in the street here. So here's another slide about these adaptation action areas. That was another project that I managed for.
Quick question on that last slide where you saw the end of, I noticed they've added those. Is that not allow seawater in? Is that the same thing as the valve?
Mm-hmm.
It is, okay.
There's different types of valves. That one, if you've ever been to a birthday celebration and you blow into a little whistle, that's exactly what that is. It's when there's pressure from water from the land side, it opens up. then it rolls.
Yeah, they're great. The problem, yeah, so the water can't come in, it can only go out. So these have made a huge difference, and they're very reasonable compared to raising the road, right? So yeah, back to these adaptation action areas. So I actually did a project with the City of Fort Lauderdale, which creating statewide resources. You know, most of my projects are funded by the DEO, the Department of Economic Opportunity in Tallahassee. So it's really cool because it's on their website. We made all these videos. We have the mayor of Fort Lauderdale, the former director of public works, the budget director, and they're talking about sea level rise and adaptation action areas. So you can check those out. I think if you just Google DEO adaptation action areas, you can see the videos and there's a guidebook. So this was a great project because hopefully, you know, this is a tool for all of the state, that it's in the statute. It's optional and it's very flexible, but any local government can implement these. So this is my last slide, and it's always, I like to get back to communication because, you know, I'm talking to you guys and I've tried to make this talk relevant to something that'll be useful for you. And I think that's kind of, it's really important when you're communicating about these issues because you want to explain it in a way that is a call to action, but also relates to something that people care about. So if you're talking to realtors or developers, you could talk about what's the property value that's vulnerable at each increment of sea level rise, you know, kind of like that Zillow study, or there's a lot of other studies out there. It's pretty simple to calculate. So there's the financial impacts. There's also health impacts. You know, some people that you talk to, they're, you know, if you're talking to someone that's concerned about Zika, the standing water from the flooding, you know, that's any type of vector disease is an issue. The mold is an issue with the flooding. So health is huge. Habitat loss, environmental justice. You know, there's not that many low income communities in low lying areas just because we have that ridge, you know, in the spine of poverty between 95 and the Turnpike. That's a high area. So they're okay. That's also good news. In most places. My favorite is the future generations. You know, I'm a mom and I do this for my kids. This is my son, George. And we did a photo shoot where we made all these children stand in water levels that were equivalent to the sea level rise that they'll see in their lifetime. So, you know, this picture kind of brings it home for me because I grew up here and I want my kids to grow up here and enjoy the beach. And I think they will. I think they're, you know, maybe not their kids. You know, I think there's a lot of hope, and I think that's the issue, is that this concept of that the impacts are catastrophic long term, but the changes are creeping. You know, every year just a little bit, teeny bit, we don't notice it, and it's really just the psychology of risk is that certain characteristics that have, you know, like what are people so worried about? Terrorism, plane crashes, you know, these like random, unpredictable, deathly things versus, you know, sea level rise is the opposite. It's something that's happening very slowly every year. There's things that we can do to prepare. So we don't take it as seriously as we should. Not we, I do. Now you won't. But there, you know, I think that, and then there's all this, you know, messaging that's happening about it. It's very simple and straightforward. There's, you know, these are the risks. There's things we can do to prepare. So, and we're doing them. You know, the local governments are doing a lot. So there's a lot of hope. And I think it's a positive thing. It's just, you know, you can't, I remember you said this once, you can't solve a problem if you don't know it exists. And I love that. I love that line. And it's beautiful. So that's it, I'm done.
Thank you, Karen, very much. Really appreciate it. Couple questions rolled in from our virtual attendees here. Jordan Howard asked, are there any other states that have a similar level of tidal effect as Florida? Such as Texas, California. I mean, how does that affect northern coastal communities and such, or is it more the southern?
Well, I mean, anywhere along the coast, especially, you know, in Norfolk, Virginia, it's crazy what's happening there because they have this rebound, the glacial rebound, and there's having subsidence. And there's some kind of meteor that hit there. It's just like a crazy geology. So there's definitely other areas that are having, you know, issues that are, I think what's the thing about Miami and Fort Lauderdale, why the risk is so high is, yeah, there's low-lying area, but there's also the exposure because of our property values being so high. So if you look at Norfolk, Virginia, like they're having the same issues, but they don't have these like huge fancy high rises or, you know, the type of stuff that we have. You know, you mentioned tidal range. So tidal range is the good news, right? We have good news. The good news for us is our storm surge isn't as high as other areas. We couldn't get a Sandy type surge. And also the tidal range is very small, considering like our tidal range is about 2 feet. That's nothing compared to as you move north along the coast, tidal range gets bigger, storm surge gets bigger. It can be, you know, areas of New England, it could be 10 feet. So we don't get our extreme tides are extreme for our area, but they're not as high as other areas.
Does that exacerbate that? So like you're in Anchorage, you gotta, you know, where the sea comes and goes in and out, you know, 150 feet. Is that more pronounced near the poles? Or no, it has nothing to do with it?
No, it has to do with, like, for example, the reason that we have a low tidal range is we have the Bahamas. And so, yeah, it just has to do, there's a lot of kind of Pacific offshore ocean circulation. You know, again, the Gulf Stream, this is a huge unknown that we really need to understand more because as it's slowing down, there's, you know, it's like a traffic jam, like it's getting backed up. And so we have this kind of column offshore, as Dr. Gassman mentioned, that's kind of thinning out. And so that's contributing right now to most of our sea level rise. And I don't think it's going to go away because the reason, you know, the Gulf Stream, did you mention this, that it's slowing down because up near Greenland? So, right. Is there another question?
Now, it doesn't look like it online. Anybody else? Questions?
It sounds like there's lots of local and statewide stuff happening, really in the right direction to, you know, get us through stuff. Are we kind of insulated from what's happening? I don't know if that's my own. Things are going to go.
Yeah, we actually had at our office last week this week actually, our region administrator from the EPA, and she was trying to explain to us about the transition and that, you know, the work is going to continue. But I think, you know, I'm trying to be really positive about it. That's all. I think so much is
like your funding and stuff. Is it kind of safe and insulated? Like you know, like it looks like you get so much data from NSA and stuff, and
I think that it's that there's unknowns, but enough is happening at the local level, and I'm sure that's what you're going to talk about. That, you know, I think we're okay. Like most of the funding does not come from the federal government for our local. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. When you talk about climate change, there's two aspects. There's the mitigation aspect where we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, which is really a global issue where every single person on the planet and countries as a whole have to change their regulations in order to deal with it. And then there's the adaptation side, which is dealing with the consequences of the things that are already happening and that we can reasonably predict will happen. So all adaptation is local, whereas mitigation has to be global. The adaptation piece has to be local. And the formation of the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact that developed the sea level rise projections, they formed because they weren't getting enough feedback and enough support from the state and federal government, recognizing that they need to do something locally because we could not wait for them to do what we needed to do. Fort Lauderdale is investing huge amounts of money in developing their own resilience. And we're going to see that from every community. Would we like there to be more support from the state and more support from the feds in terms of funding for those types of activities? We absolutely would. Currently, this is providing grant funding to reduce flooding. They're providing mitigation dollars for flooding, which is fantastic. So my expectation going forward with the new administration is that we will see bigger challenges with trying to get funding for types of projects for adaptation at the local level. But local governments are recognizing that they're going to have to be very creative about their funding. Any sales tax is one of those opportunities that is now passed, fortunately. Raising stormwater utility fees, trying to do special assessments in neighborhoods where they need to raise the road. We're going to be seeing more of those local type funding initiatives in order to deal with these issues. But at the most basic level, adaptation is local.
From happening. Like this is baked in. There's a certain amount of sea fluoride that's in the pipeline. Even if we cut off all our emissions, stop driving our cars, like this is a done deal that we're committed to. Because we can find a way to suck all this heat and carbon out.
But we should still
Yeah, exactly. Well, clearly,
but at the same time, we have to recognize that we're going to have these impacts.
it's a balance. I mean, long term, we do need to reduce our emissions, but you know, just to deal with the flooding that's happening today, it's a local issue. I had another point. Yeah, I mean Mm. Right. I mean, the biggest areas affected are actually in Southeast Asia, like India, Mumbai. They're having, it's going to.
Karen pointed out that sea level rise doesn't affect areas equally. We talked a little bit about Norfolk. Norfolk's rate of sea level rise is 2 to 3 times. That's right. No. I mean, if you compare us to other coastal regions,
Because you know it doesn't. I look at the flood zones and then with the groundwater and the elevation, and it doesn't make sense. I don't think it makes sense.
it's all driven by the federal government, and it really depends on how the policy changes. The bigger water bill would have our flood rates 10 times higher than they are currently. that was pulled back because people were being given flood insurance bills that were 1/3 the value of their property annually. That's been pulled back, but they are going to be considering that, and it'll be interesting to see under this new administration how they address the flood insurance issues.
That will certainly impact realtors. I'll sell my house if I have to pay for just flood insurance. So
Right.
likewise, now I know to look for that. Most people would.
I think that's a huge point because I think that, you know, there's going to be some kind of wake up call. And I don't know what it's going to be, but it could be the point somewhere in the future where insurance rates are limiting property value. And, or it could be a big hurricane, or it could be like champion in the community that gets us all to wake up, right?
But I think the other aspect of that is that you have to think about it from a socioeconomic standpoint too. There are people who can buy a house for cash. Those people aren't required to have flood insurance. They're not required, right?
Yeah.
You only
it's just
have
the bank. Yeah. And I know a lot of people that are doing that. A lot of people are like, I'm not going to pay $2,000 a year for insurance.
If you
I
don't
just,
have a mortgage, if you don't have a mortgage, you don't have to pay. You don't have to buy wind insurance. You don't have to have flood insurance. Those are choices that can be made by people with the economic means to self-insure. And so part of what we're going to be seeing in people afford to buy a house where they want for cash, and those people that cannot. And so you're gonna just demographics in some of these, for example, waterway communities will shift to those people who can afford to live there and they can afford to self-insure.
and not only that, there's the Loma. Like people can argue their flood zone, but it's expensive. So you can fork out $10,000-$20,000 to get yourself out of a flood zone. So certain people can afford that, and the other people that can't. I read an article about a community called Dry Creek, and they all of a sudden got put in a flood zone, and they were so mad, and they just didn't one.
The other thing I should mention is we adopted new maps 2 years ago, and it actually dramatically reduced the number of properties that were in flood zones because of a bunch of the changes that were made with building codes and things along those lines.
I just want to make 2 points really quick. That last week I was at a conference called Companies versus Climate Change, and there were a lot of people there. That, you know, it's not just the government. You know, there has to be more and more partnerships of the local governments working with, you know, citizens, homeowners, working with the businesses, because it's going to you have to work together, right? If there's part of the seawall on public land and some on private, you know, both people have to agree. And then, so that's the one point. And the other is that, you know, you talked about what's being done that's not being kind of labeled as adapting to sea level rise. I was at another conference this week scale, it went from 1 million to 500,000 to 200,000. That hasn't happened here. So you see two properties that are almost identical, same price, but one is 2 or 3 feet lower. So, you know, you can use these tools that the client can't make a decision between two houses. You get positions. They're like, I don't know which one I want. You can look at the tools and say, I'll go for this one because, you know, less chance of it flooding.
More resilient.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the flood zone, two properties are in the same flood zone, but one of them could have area, it could have parts of it that are much lower.
What we talk about marketing and looking at the properties with the lens of resilience. Which property is less vulnerable? Which property will bounce back if there is some sort of catastrophic event? And looking for those features. Don't just this is a thing. If the air conditioner on the ground or is it elevated? You know, take the time to look for those aspects. And the people that are out there are asking more of those types of questions. Your clients are asking types of questions more and more.
And it's not just about what is the elevation within your parcel, right? It's the ingress and egress. Because if at some point in the future during high tide, you have to drive through salt water. Mm-hmm.
You know, it's one of the things most agencies specialize in water farm where we are, but on the agents, we have, you know, a couple miles out on the other side 95, you know, probably don't consider this at all.
Well, I think one of the important journalists mentioned this is that our topography, further west you go, the lower the land is. And one of the challenges that we've talked about is, you know, we've shown you the pictures of if you have a high tide that blocks off the storm system. Well, it also blocks off the storm system for the people who are out west. And if they have a very, very severe rainfall during an extreme high tide, those water areas cannot drain because they drain to the ocean. And if the ocean is very high, they can't drain either. So this is not, sea level rise is not a topic for people who can see the water from their backyard. It is a topic for anybody in Florida.
Guys, you know, I'm in the elevation data. There's something really crazy that happens on Atlantic Boulevard. I live just west of Atlantic Boulevard. Okay, so if I've stood there, like, 'cause I fill up gas there on Atlantic and US 1, and I've tried to see it. There's a difference of like 10 feet. When you go north, there's just some kind of geologic ridge or something like it. Looking north to south, it's like a very small distance. Broward County is in Deerfield Beach, 30 feet. And then if there's, as you go,
It's right at Atlantic, right at on the south
right here,
the north side of Atlantic.
if your client can't decide, like, take them north of Atlantic, take them more towards Lighthouse Point is in much better shape than Lauderdale by the Sea in general, especially if you're on or coastal. And then as you go west, that kind of difference, it moves to Commercial Boulevard. So like anything south of Commercial Boulevard is kind of less than 10 feet. Anything in elevation, anything north of Commercial Boulevard is higher than 10 feet. You know, that's what my sea level. You know, like people don't know. The easy answer is like 100 feet. I don't know. Yeah. So it's and it makes a difference whether you're at 5 feet or 10 feet or 15 feet, and we have all those ranges for our county. But it doesn't. It's not about whether you're inland or at the coast. Like those elevations exist. It's just weird topography in Broward County. Yeah.
Years ago, I looked at a house just north of west of US 1, just by 2 blocks. It's one house, 17 foot above.
Yeah. It's very high. Yeah, exactly. And you can even tell that. I mean, it's something. I have to look at the data to understand.
That there are houses that are 4, 5, 6 feet higher than the house 3 doors down. Yeah. So it is something. Again, it's a potential selling point to have a house that's at a high.
It is.
I've got to get to my next. So I want to thank you all for your attention.
This month. Yeah. Doing that. So that one's a little